very powerful opening statement by the prosecutors in the Cheyanne Harris case, describing what led to the death of her 4-month-old son. Just a tragic story, but she was, again, convicted yesterday. But I want to break down what we saw throughout the course of this case. I'm going to bring in Joseph Scott Morgan. He's a forensic death investigator. Joseph, we just heard the prosecutor describe how one of the issues that led to this 4-month-old child's death was diaper rash. So in a case of neglect like this, tell our audience, what's your take on putting together what led to this child's death for the purposes of trial?
Yeah, good morning, by the way, Misty. One of the things that we consider when we take a look at, say, for instance, child abuse cases is when, the perpetrators are actively engaged in abusing a child. Neglect is something that is completely different. That is that they have to go to great lengths to ignore basic necessities such as food, light, warmth, water, these sorts of things, protection from the elements. So and the thing about biology is this: we can kind of track, or pathology, we can track the progression of these indwelling diseases. They talked about diaper rash, and diaper rash in and of itself isn't the killer. The underlying killer here is septicemia, which means that the child had a system-wide infection that resulted from neglect as a result of not being the diaper rash not being attended to.
Right, and we know that some of the other facts that came out with this, that the experts said the baby had been in this swing for 9 to 14 days in the same diaper. So certainly, of course, different experts might come to a different conclusion, but certainly that speaks volumes when you're talking about a neglect case. But Joseph, I want to talk to you a little bit about what the prosecutor was focusing on in the opening statement. There was a lot of discussion about the apartment, what the apartment looked like, how many rooms. From your perspective as a forensic death investigator, why was that important for the prosecutor to present out front in that manner?
I think that one of the striking things here, Misty, is the fact that it took almost as much effort to neglect this child as it would have to have provided some level of basic care for the child. They had to sequester this child in the back room. They kept it dark. They had to walk past that door regularly when the child was still able to make some kind of noise. I won't say vocalize, but be able to, to cry out, the standard thing you hear babies do when they need something. And they had to ignore this all the while. Whereas, the rest of the apartment was reasonably appointed. It was there was foodstuffs there. The other occupants of the apartment were being taken care of. So it's quite the dichotomy, isn't it? When you can come to court with this kind of evidence and you can show this environment in which this little angel indwelled and essentially dwindled away, whereas everybody else in the apartment was thriving. So that's a stark contrast, and that's really a difficult uphill battle for the defense to have to overcome.
Yeah, certainly, Joseph. Those are all great points. And I think that was some of the most shocking information that came out during the trial, is that there just seemed to be this active ignoring of this baby, as opposed to the other people that were in the residence that were living what we would qualify as a somewhat normal existence. So we're going to continue to break down this case. We do have to go to a break, but make sure to stick with us. More on Cheyanne Harris when we return. Welcome back. Right now, we're breaking down the Cheyanne Harris case. For those of you just joining us, this is the Iowa mom who was found guilty in the death of her 4-month-old son. Cheyanne Harris was found guilty of first-degree murder and child endangerment. Sterling Cohn, this beautiful 4-month-old child, was found dead in his baby swing, covered in maggots. The medical examiners concluded that the baby had not been bathed or changed in over a week. Some horrifying details coming out during this trial, ultimately leading to the conviction of Cheyanne Harris. Well, we watched the prosecutor's very emotional and impactful opening statement. Now, let's see what the defense had to say in their openings during the Cheyanne Harris trial. Take a look.
There's no doubt that this case it's a terrible case. It's a tragedy. You're going to wonder what kind of monster could do something like this. The monster in this case is mental health. The monster in this case is depression, postpartum, substance abuse. You're going to hear evidence in this case about Ms. Harris, what she was going through, how she suffered from depression, how she suffered from postpartum, and how she self-medicated. You're not going to hear in this case about the typical type of actions you might hear when you hear about child abuse. You're not going to hear about injuries. You're not going to hear about broken bones. You're not going to hear about bruises. You're not going to hear about any purpose on Ms. Harris's part to harm Sterling. You're not going to hear about any evil design or any plan or any ill will towards Sterling. You're not going to hear any evidence that she's evil. That's because she's not evil, and this case is not murder.
That was opening statements by the defense, a lot shorter than what we heard from the prosecutor. I want to bring in Justice Scott Morgan again to talk to us about this. Now, interestingly enough, Joseph, the defense focused on talking about what would be affirmative cases of abuse. She said no broken bones, no bruises. What did you make of this opening statement?
Well, the problem is if you're going to go down the road of abuse, this is not abuse. This is a case of neglect. So we're talking about giraffes when we should be talking about zebra. It's a completely different animal from what they're talking about. One of the things, going back to what we were talking about the scene, Misty, relative to this, is that not only does the defense have to overcome what the mother did, they have to overcome what this adult male did in the house as well. And they have to overcome it. This idea that not only did you have one adult in the house that was ignoring the cries of this poor little helpless child, you had another adult that was doing the same thing. And so that makes this case all the more striking when you put it in context like that.
Absolutely. And as these facts continue to unfold, wow, it's really just difficult to swallow that this child was subjected to these types of conditions. We're going to move on and listen to some more testimony in this case. This is Tony Friedrich. This is a registered nurse and a first responder. Take a listen.
Department?
Yes.
What did you do?
So I pulled up, and I pulled right up, and I saw a man, a woman, and a little girl, and I got out my car and I went running up to them and said, "Where's the baby?" Nobody was showing any emotion, and the man goes, "Inside," and I said, "Show me." And so he took me inside. We walked in and we went to the back bedroom. He took me to the back bedroom, and it was dark and it was stuffy, and there was a stench of urine there.
What did you see when the lights came on?
Well, you could see the swing. It was facing an outside wall in the corner. And so then I went over so I could see Sterling, the baby. Found out that's what his name was. And to do my assessment, look, listen, and feel, his eyes were fixed and dilated, staring straight out. He had blood around his mouth, and I went to check a brachial pulse on him, and his arm was stiff and rigid and cold. All of his extremities were cold. His little feet were cold. His hands were clenched in a fist, and he wasn't breathing.
What did you do?
Well, after I did my assessment and realized that I couldn't do anything, I called back into the sheriff's department and asked for the sheriff to come and another medical examiner.
Why did you call the sheriff's department?
Because this was not right. Something was not right.
This was not right. Something was not right. This is a professional on the stand, a first responder at the scene in very emotional testimony. When you see a professional like this exuding such emotion, you can only imagine the shock they must have felt on the scene. I'm going to bring Joseph Scott Morgan in again. Look, there were a lot of details there from a first responder, and you could feel her emotion on the stand. Something that I found to be striking, she talked about blood around the mouth of the child. Can you explain the implications of that to us?
Sure. I'll be glad to, Misty. One of the things that we're taking into consideration here, remember, she talked about how the little jumper that the child had on was also kind of crusty. One of the things that's going on here is that the child is probably in congestive failure. That means the lungs have gotten precipitously heavy. Child's having difficulty breathing. And this goes, and so when this happens, you kind of get this frothy edematous cone that comes around the mouth, and it leaves this kind of staining that goes on. And this goes to something that's deeper and darker here. We get an idea of the suffering that this child would have gone through. If you can imagine, the child's in a position where he can't move, he can't get relief in this horrible environment. It's dark. He's photosensitive, by the way, because it's dark in there. He doesn't know what's happening. And then now he begins to get into this position where he can't breathe. And this is as a result of the malnutrition, the dehydration sort of thing that's going on. Oh, and by the way, he's uncomfortable because he's got little bugs indwelling his diaper along with maggot. So the whole totality of this thing comes crashing down in the courtroom, per the words of this first responder. And trust me, this lady she's been around the block a time or two. She's seen some things. This obviously impacted her and affected her, and probably will impact her for years to come.
Joseph, you said it right there, because when you're talking about a professional in this field who's going to go to crime scenes, who's going to have seen other crime scenes, it always, when they're emotional on the stand, it means that there is an extreme situation. Something you brought up that I thought was interesting in her testimony, this blanket covering the window, or the fact that there's no light. What does that, this hot room, no light, what does that all mean? I don't know.
I've kind of scratched my head over this too. I'm thinking, is it a shield to prevent people from looking in so that they can't see what's going on within the room? Or is this just a kind of a way of I don't know. I don't know how I want to wax poetic here and just say that it's some kind of metaphorical coffin they put this little baby in life, just to kind of push him away. It's kind of a warehouse situation. We're just going to sit around and wait till he dies, what medical people refer to as the dwindles many times, and he just wastes away. And, it's a real head scratcher. My thought is, if they did hang those curtains, and I wish that this had been explored, if they did hang those blankets over the curtains, were they doing this in order to shield from an ongoing criminal event here, to prevent people from looking in the window to see what's going on? Because I've got to tell you, if any right-thinking person would have come along and peered through that window and seen that,
right,
they would have been aghast, just like this lady we just saw.
Of course they would have been. It seems like there was no hiding this situation if someone were to actually be able to see what was going on. We do have to go to a break, but we will be back with more on the Cheyanne Harris trial when we return. Just one of the most shocking facts about this case is that there was another child in the home. I want to bring in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, what do you make of that? What's the impact on this other child? So here we have a neighbor who didn't even know there was a baby.
Yeah, it's kind of void space, isn't it? And what it demonstrates to the court is the fact that the parents, it demonstrates capability, their ability to take care of another child. And we see this image here of him and this child, and that child is obviously thriving, whereas the other one, whom they chose not to take care of. Remember, this is not an abuse case; it's a neglect case, where they have neglected, just kind of ignored, as if the child didn't even exist. That's what makes this so striking, and this woman is bringing this point home here. So, from the perspective of the prosecution, this is powerful testimony, because everything has to be contextualized, right, in court, and you can't take the jury back in time. Only through these words can they see what is happening. And talking about that they were a family. They did have this other child that they had nourished and taken care of, but yet, where's the other baby?
Right,
she
absolutely.
never had an awareness of it.
It's so strange. We're going to continue to listen to the testimony. This is more from Jennifer Shriver about what she observed of the Harris household. Take a look.
Now, where was the baby during this conversation?
I'm assuming she left him inside and the baby.
How long was Miss Harris outside with you while the baby was inside?
About 20 minutes to a half hour.
Did Miss Harris have any baby monitor or any other device that she could use to monitor the baby in the apartment?
No.
Where she was at when you were talking to her, could she have heard the baby from the apartment?
Maybe, maybe not. We weren't on the corner the whole time.
You were outside, right?
We were outside, yes.
So you said that the storm was in the early part of July. Would this have been a few weeks later, so maybe the middle part of July?
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. I'm not 100% sure.
And so how was it that you met Mr. Combs?
I went outside to talk to my boyfriend, and he was in there, and I introduced myself to him and told him he had a really cute daughter, that she looked just like him.
And was that Nowell that you were talking about?
Yes, sir.
Did you also offer to look after Nowell if needed?
Yes.
Why did you do that?
It seemed like Cheyanne needed to maybe get out of the house. She seemed kind of sad every time I see her.
All right, Joseph, let's bring you in to talk a little bit about this now. A lot of this testimony is about how, all right, there's a baby, she's outside, this woman is outside talking to Cheyanne, there's no baby monitor. This is very powerful for the jury, especially when you take into consideration that one of the statements Cheyanne Harris made to police that came out during the trial was, I should have checked on the baby more. What do you make of it?
Yeah, more. I'd like to know, how more is measured, retrospectively. And you hear this woman, this witness saying, was she not able to even hear the child? She had no baby monitor. She had no way of keeping track. So this goes again to this idea that the child is being completely ignored. Sterling is just being completely ignored. He's kind of a throwaway, if you will, that is just languishing and dwindling away all this time. Remember, the time is clicking off the clock at this point in time, while even they're standing there talking. Yeah, she should have paid more attention to the child. She should have given more attention to the child. That goes without saying. And it paints a very grim picture of what's going on inside of that house. If this woman only knew at that time, I'm sure she would have done something, but she had no way of knowing.
And that's what is so interesting about this case, the fact that you have, and tragic, actually, the fact that you have little Sterling in this room, completely isolated to the point where a neighbor doesn't even know he exists. We do have to go to a break, but make sure that you stick with us. More on this tragic story when we return. Stay with us. There's so much to unpack here with this testimony, so I want to dive right in with Joseph Scott Morgan. So, Joseph, something that struck me when we're watching Sheila Schroeder from Child Protective Services interview is that Cheyanne and Sterling's father apparently had come to the conclusion in their minds that Sterling had died from sudden infant death syndrome. Now, we've heard some facts that obviously are contrary to that. Can you explain that to us from your technical point of view?
Yeah, to keep in mind when we talk about SIDS, it used to be referred to as crib death. The key word here is sudden infant death syndrome. Sterling's death was not sudden. Okay, we need to establish that up front. This was a long, languishing event that took place over a period of time, and the fact that or the statement that they had concluded that it was in fact SIDS, they're whistling past the graveyard at that point in time. I believe they're trying to convince themselves and maybe others that that is what happened. But that obviously is not the case. SIDS impacts families all over this country. I've been in the living rooms, in hospital rooms, in ER rooms, ER treatment rooms with families who are just brokenhearted over the fact that their seemingly healthy baby died or passed away during the night, and they tried everything they could to resuscitate the child. This was not the case in Sterling's case. He sat there and dwindled away in that little swing in that darkened room for a long period of time. So I think that their assessment, the family's assessment, can kind of be brushed off as nothing more than maybe some kind of parlor trick.
Right.
This child did not die from SIDS.
Right, and the death here was absolutely preventable with even slightly more care than he was given. Just
slightly. I'm talking about just the minimum they could have applied and rescued this child. Yeah.
And here's another fact that we didn't hear this in the testimony, but the testimony of the Child Protective Services was that CPS had no relationship. They had not seen the family. They had not had any contact with the family prior to the death of Sterling. Now, one of the reports that we've read indicates that there were warning signs starting as early as Sterling's birth, when there was a test done on the umbilical cord and it proved positive for meth. Now, the police officers that investigated the case did not become aware of this until after Sterling's death. But Joseph, as someone who has worked in this field and seen these types of tragic cases, how can something like this fall through the cracks? How does that not put this mother on someone's radar?
Yeah, this is a disconnect between law enforcement and generally the social services director at the hospital wherever the child is born. This happens over and over again, and I think that the hospitals and their staffs are tasked with trying to protect knowledge of the sensitive knowledge of the family, and unfortunately in this case, that attempt to protect the mother's drug status trumped Sterling's life in the end. If they had interdicted all that time back and maybe gotten her treatment or routed her in a different way, maybe the outcome would have been different. But at the end of the day, the fault in its totality rests at the feet of the mother and the father because they neglected this child to the point where the child died.
Absolutely, Joseph. And I think something that really sticks and hits home, and I know that in your professional career and as an analyst, you've covered so many of these cases. As an attorney and as a legal analyst, I've covered so many of these tragic cases, and the worst part is that this is something that is truly preventable. This 4-month-old did not have to suffer in this way. Had there been just somebody that asked, where's this baby? Or if the hospital had sent those records or someone had followed up immediately, we may not find ourselves in this situation today. We do have to go to a break, but we will continue to break down the Cheyanne Harris case when we return. Defense strategy: accept responsibility for child endangerment, but say this was not a case of murder. Joseph Scott Morgan, I'd like your input on this. You've covered so many trials. You've been involved as an expert in trials. What did you make of the closing arguments for the prosecution and the defense?
Well, for the prosecution, I think that it was neat tidily. It was tied up very neatly and to the point, and that's what you want in this particular case. You've got one child that had thrived. You've got another one that didn't. There is, they're going for murder one here. So there's, you can't say that both kids were just totally neglected and that this was a postpartum depression event, because one child was being administered to, the other child was not. So I like that. I think that the defense did the best that they could with what they had to work with. This is not a difficult case, in my opinion, to prosecute from an evidentiary standpoint, because the evidence just screams at you from this. So at this point in time, all the defense can do is just essentially throw something out there and see if there is any kind of way that they can call for mercy for this girl in this particular context.
Right, and so the question becomes, all of this considered, what we've seen throughout the trial considered, is it enough for a murder one conviction? Well, here's the verdict. Take a look.
Please rise. State of Iowa versus Cheyanne Harris, FECR 011490. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree. Count 2, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of child endangerment causing the death of a child. Mr. Foreperson, is this the verdict of the jury on both counts?
There we have it. The jury verdict is in. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of child endangerment, mandatory life sentence without parole. Joseph Scott Morgan, I want to bring you back in. I know you have to leave us soon, but what do you think? Are you surprised by the verdict?
No, I'm not, and I have to say that if I was a defense attorney and they were going to say you have to defend this case, this is not one I would just rush out and want to select. These people did the best that they could with what they had. There was an overwhelming amount of information that was thrown at the jury here, and none of it good for the defendant, particularly when you look at how Sterling was treated in light of the life that they were leading. They talked about, the prosecution talked about, you're making $45K a year. Your rent is only a few $100 a month. Why can't you take care of this child? Oh, and by the way, you've got drug activity going on in the house. And so all of this, the sum total of everything, is just too much of a weight for defense to have to bear in this.
I think you're absolutely right, and you hit some of the points that I thought were critical. Number one, the forensic testimony. Number two, the fact there's another child. It's not a matter of you don't know what to do. Number three, you have the resources. Yep.
And that does kind of bring it all home, doesn't it? So many of us, love little kids, and I would imagine many people on the jury do too, and they're thinking about this child, this picture that has been painted by the prosecution relative to this, again, I'll say it, this dwindling away that this child went through. And it wasn't just merely a passive dwindling. This child suffered, Misty, suffered horribly under these circumstances in this darkened room with the cycle of flies that are in and out, the pain of the diaper rash, all of these sorts of things. And that's a very, very powerful construct for them to grasp hold of.
Absolutely.
I thought the prosecution did a great job.
Joseph, yes, the prosecution hit it home. Joseph Scott Morgan, thank you so much for being with us. We hope to see you soon. We do have to go to a break, but when we return, we'll continue to break down today's most exciting trials.